It's funny, we were talking yesterday, and a few of us, and I pointed out, it all comes back to this. Woe to me if all men speak well of me. That's one of the most important things Jesus said. If you are doing and saying what you should do and say that honors God, and that fits, that aligns with what Jesus has communicated in the Gospels, then there should be some serious opposition. There should be some people unhappy with you. And sure enough, I've experienced that with this book. But you know what? It makes you a better person. It makes you stronger. It makes you more committed with resolve to the commitments and the positions that you've come to. So I encourage you to think through this possibility, whether Hebrew could be the language of the world's oldest alphabetic script. Now, here's kind of the story on how this works. Actually, I was supposed to be studying for comprehensive exams for my PhD one day, and I stumbled on evidence that I knew is connected in the form of the bodies of four types of animals: sheep, goat, cattle, and dogs. Those are the four animals mentioned in Exodus 11 and 12. Evidence that showed that these were very odd burials and that the majority were sheep and goats and the majority were in their first year of age. From the very site of Aris that we talked about last night, which is where Jacob settled. And most of these burials were mass burials, multiple sheep and goats together. And some of them died from a blow to the back of the head by a blunt implement. Can you imagine that? Does that sound familiar to you? Something like the Passover event? And I knew that's what it was. So I got on my bicycle academically, and I started to do research. And my research question was this: if this is actually powerful evidence of the 10th plague on Egypt that connects with the time that the Israelites were there. And by the way, the very little pottery that was in those graves is pottery from the reigns of Thutmose III and Amenhotep II. Surprise of all surprises. Being the father of the Exodus Pharaoh and the Exodus Pharaoh. So I decided, my research question was, if this is indeed evidence of Israelites in Egypt at the end of the time there, right before the Exodus, shouldn't there be evidence that they were there for 430 years when Exodus 12, 40, and 41 makes that clear with the right position on the textual variant that's there? And I thought, there's got to be a way to find some kind of evidence. They can't be ghosts for 430 years. And so in that course of attempting to answer that research question, as I like to phrase it, I fell into, or God caused me to stumble into one gold mine after another. And part of that was realizing that Joseph's oldest son, Manasseh, was involved in the creation of the earliest alphabetic script. Because he was the one, as Chebed, he who was disfavored, the father of Shechem, Joshua 17:6 identifies as one of the sons of Manasseh. This guy wrote the world's first alphabetic letter in 1842 BC. And that made me say, wow, if he and possibly his brother Ephraim in the shadows were the two who did this, everything would make sense. That two fluent Egyptian writers and speakers would be the ones to invent the alphabet. It makes perfect sense. But what I came to was, when I saw that this alphabetic letter was in the caption of this inscription that Chebed, he was disfavored, Manasseh wrote, that's when I knew I needed to study and figure out what this was. Because when I looked at that alphabetic letter on a mostly Middle Egyptian caption, I didn't know what it was at first. That's where I was at. I didn't know what in the world that was. I knew the sign list, right? I minored in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. I know the 800 hieroglyphs in the sign list. This wasn't one of them. And there was a second pictograph in the caption that Manasseh wrote, which was an hourglass-looking thing, we can call it, and I didn't know what that was. So I called up a friend of mine who teaches in New Zealand, who is from Australia. He's my dad's age, Brian Coles, and I said, and he's been a Western Semiticist for decades, going back to, I don't know, 80s or 70s, somewhere in there or before. And I said, and he didn't really know Middle Egyptian. He knew some things about it, but he didn't really study it formally. And I showed him the inscription, I showed him the caption, and I showed him those two pictographs that made no sense to me. And I said, what is the hourglass and what is this big box-looking thing? And he said, oh, that's easy. The hourglass-looking thing is an ingot, and that makes the we sound. It's a Canaanite syllabic. And he said, the box-looking thing is a proto-consonantal letter, and that makes the b sound. And I thought, wow, now I really need to study things, because I knew that this was the oldest alphabetic letter, and I knew that an Israelite wrote it, and I knew that the oldest alphabet hasn't been deciphered, and maybe God's calling me to be the one to do that. So what I had to do, and this all goes back to the beauty of how God makes us, he needed for this role, he needed somebody who is an absolute freak with detail, who can sit there for hour after hour after hour and look at things that would drive people crazy, who would not be satisfied until he solved every conceivable question that could be solved in relation to the study. That's how he made me. What did I have to do first? First, I had to catch up on 150 years of scholarship. Try that sometime. For 150 years, we've known about the script, and there have been opinions about it, and there have been conclusions drawn. Almost everybody agrees that it's Semitic. It's a Semitic language, and Hebrew is one of the Semitic languages. It's considered a Western Semitic language. There are other Semitic languages. But I knew I needed to understand what was the history of scholarship so that I can benefit from all of those who went before me. And so that I could maybe, if it's possible, take things a little bit further, because I knew the language. And I taught Hebrew, every level of Hebrew up before this time. So I was equipped in that way, and having had Middle Egyptian as my minor and my PhD, I know the source that it comes from, so I can understand things that other scholars who never knew Middle Egyptian, never studied it, they could never figure out, even if they spent their whole lives working on the world's oldest alphabetic script. What an amazing opportunity. So I caught up on 150 years of scholarship. I saw where there were certain letters that seemed pretty foolproof for their consonantal value, how they're pronounced. Is it a b, t, s, r, or whatever? And I knew there were disputed letters where certain scholars agreed and certain scholars disagreed. So what I was able to do, what other scholars couldn't do because they didn't know it was Hebrew, I was able to have a little science experiment. And my science experiment occurred on the pages, if you will, of these 10 or 15 inscriptions that could be deciphered if you knew what the letters were. So what I did for all of the disputed letters is I superimposed all of the options that scholars were suggesting, and maybe even one or two others that they hadn't suggested, to see if that would work in these inscriptions. Because if you get the right consonantal value, it's going to be correct every time that letter shows up in an inscription. If you get it wrong, you're going to be right less than 100% of the time. And it's not always going to have a sensible translation, sensible meaning. So by process of elimination, I was able to resolve every one of those disputed letters. And this took an enormous amount of time. And when I was done, I was convinced now that I have the right phonetic value for every consonant in the world's oldest alphabetic script. The next thing I needed to do was figure out what was behind the picture with the letter, because every letter had a picture, and that's how the system worked. You have to know what the picture was so you can think of the word that goes with that picture and pronounce the first letter, and we're going to get into that in a minute. So with that being the case, what I did is I took several Hebrew lexicons, and a lexicon is a dictionary, and I dealt with one Hebrew letter at a time, and I studied every single biblical Hebrew word under each letter, Hebrew letter, one at a time. And looked at all of the possible ways of drawing that letter that the ancient authors would use to inscribe it. And I compared what I was looking at with what I was reading for the meaning of word after word after word. And I would make a list for every Hebrew letter of the possible ways of seeing this and understanding this pictograph to be. And then I went through the list of only the realistic options and started weeding out the bad options from there. And by process of elimination, was able to come up with what I was convinced was the only plausible word behind that pictograph. And with that, I did it for every single letter of the Hebrew Bible and came up with what I would hold today now as is the right meaning behind every word. For example, when I saw that letter on this mostly Middle Egyptian inscriptions that was in the shape of this, it's almost like a square, but it's a little bit rectangular with the long end being vertical. That, of course, is the word for house. And the Hebrew word for house is bayit. So you see a house, a picture of a house, it's bayit. What do? You pronounce the B sound, and you move on to the next letter. And of course, as an ancient Hebrew, and because they didn't write vowels, you have to figure out on your own what was the vowel between those two consonants. So that's the process that I went through, a very long, tedious process. But wow, the results that came from this paid off like you can't believe. Because now that I have what I'm convinced is the right phonetic value, consonantal value for every pictograph, every letter, and I know what the picture is a picture of, and so every time I see something that looks like that, I'll be gravitating toward that letter. Now I can go back to the inscriptions that are long enough and full enough that would allow me to translate those entire inscriptions. And now all I have to work with is the time that it takes to weed through letter by letter, figuring out where words start and where they stop, because it's continuous script. When we write, we have spaces between every word. It makes everybody know when the word starts and when the word ends. They didn't do that. And of course, even worse, they didn't write vowels. So imagine deciphering an inscription, right, in an ancient language that has no vowels and no spaces between words. Really challenging. But, once again, persistence paid off. After putting in enough time in drawing out all the letters correctly and figuring out where the breaks happened and where were their words and how did it fit together, I was able to come up with a very plausible rendition or translation of every one of those inscriptions that I had intended to translate with the help of the Lord, however correct I may be, and presented them in this book. That's now out of print as of March of last year, 2020. It went out of print, and I have been doing my best to beseech my publisher to republish either a new edition or a reprinting. And so far, I haven't met with success. So if you have any inkling to help me, you will contact them and beg them to reprint the book. I think the more voices they hear, the more they kind of will figure out it needs to be done. So, if you're looking for a copy, I can't help you. There are people who write me, 5 people at least every week, who write me and ask me, how do I get a copy of your book? So, you don't have to write me. You know the answer. All right, so let's look at this together. So, I do have a few publications that will be on the periphery of this, and then, of course, the main one being my book. One is toward pinpointing the timing of the Egyptian abandonment of Avaris during the middle of the 18th dynasty. That was published in a secular Egyptological journal, the Journal of Ancient Egyptian Interconnections. And there I suggested that Avaris was abandoned during the reign of Amenhotep II, the Exodus pharaoh. I didn't write this in the article. I had no biblical allusions because I almost certainly wouldn't have passed peer review. But I do connect, and this will happen in my book that's about to come out, Origins of the Hebrews. I do connect the abandonment of Avaris during the reign of Amenhotep II with the event of the loss of the Egyptian army in the Sea of Reeds in 1446. So I encourage you to read that article. It's for free download on my academia.edu webpage. Then, along the lines of epigraphy, the study of ancient writing, or especially inscriptions, and that's the wrong date I have on here. I didn't correct this. Sometimes you do copy and paste and you don't fix everything that you paste. It should be 2015, the Ophel Pithos inscription, its dating, language, translation, and script. That's published in the Palestine Exploration Quarterly. And that deals with an inscription found in Jerusalem that dates almost certainly to the reign of Solomon, and probably the first year of Solomon's reign. It's a really exciting little inscription. So I encourage you to read that. And then my 2016 book, The World's Oldest Alphabet, that's now out of print. All right, so all of this, I don't know about you. I'm very visually oriented. Most of you probably are. If you want to see something about this whole topic, there's a filmmaker from Minneapolis named Tim Mahoney. You may know of him, who has put out some Christian documentaries that are very useful. I don't agree with everything that's in there, or everyone who has an opinion, or even with the direction that Tim Mahoney himself goes in every case. But they are wonderful films. It started with Patterns of Evidence, Exodus, which is a 2014 film. It came out in the fall of 2014. That's available on his patternsofevidence.com website if you're interested. You can probably either get a DVD or, pay and watch online. It's worth watching. I don't agree with where he seems to go with things, with some of the events that are in there, but he does put some early Exodus scholars in the film that will make it useful for you to see. Then his second film, so edition 2 of Patterns of Evidence, is The Moses Controversy. And it's funny because he was going to make his second film a study of the what happens after the Exodus, the route to Mount Sinai and where Mount Sinai is and all of that. That was going to be the focus of the second film. Then he found out about my book, and all of a sudden, the direction of his second film changed. He knew he needed a film on Moses, because he knew that my book would change everything if it's right. Because now you have evidence of Israelites in Egypt, and now you have datable inscriptions right from the time of the Exodus itself, and some of them include names of biblical figures, and that's what we're going to look at this afternoon. The biblical figures mentioned in these inscriptions. So the 3 inscriptions that name those 3 individuals. And one of them is Moses. And of course, Tim Mahoney was amazed when he saw that I was proposing that one of these inscriptions reads Moses himself, Moshe in Hebrew. So all of a sudden now, he realized, wow, if Hebrew is a language, a script, if Hebrew has a script, the Hebrew language has a script that's been in use for over 400 years by the time Moses rolls around, then what is he going to write in? Hebrew, the language of his people. And it's not a fantasy to think Moses could have written in his own Hebrew language, because it's already been in written form since the 19th century BC. So, 2019 film, and that's also available on their website if you are a visually oriented person and you want to see some of what he's done. And on my academia.edu webpage, I did a review, a critical review of this film. So you will see my suggestions for what's not correct and what could have been done differently and what's good. I tried to compliment him at every point possible. All right, so there's the cover of my book. The contents includes the background matters to prepare you to get into this study. Secondly, the inscriptions of the Middle Kingdom, that's the lifetime of Joseph, Dynasty 12. Third, inscriptions of the New Kingdom, that's Dynasty 18, the time of Moses. For concluding thoughts, basically, what do we get out of this study? What importance does it have historically and in relation to the Bible? And then a number of appendices. And with each one of the inscriptions, and I go through 15 or 16 inscriptions, I forget exactly the number, and it depends how you define a couple of them. With each inscription, I go through four things. The background to the inscription, the paleographic decipherment, what letters do I determine that are involved in that inscription, letter by letter by letter, and oftentimes I discuss that stroke by stroke by stroke when it's needed. And then translation and orthography, and finally, potential historical value. What importance is this inscription to our understanding of biblical history at the time? Where the Israelites are and what they're doing, or who may have written this and why. So, even if you don't know Hebrew, this can be of great value. And this has been a great benefit to those who have read it, even who don't know Hebrew. It will be to even more benefit and value to you if you have studied Hebrew, because you can look more critically at some of the suggestions that I make here. And there's some exciting Hebrew constructions. I wish you all knew Hebrew. I would walk you through some of the really exciting Hebrew constructions, like the min comparative. How many people get excited about the min comparative? Yeah! 1, 2, 3. There's a min comparative in Wadi El Hol 1, which is mind-blowing. Exactly what we see in biblical Hebrew. It's a comparative structure. Syntactical structure. It's not unique to Hebrew, but there aren't that many languages that attest the mean comparative. So that's the basic gist of the book. Well, how does this all work? Let's say that English doesn't have a script, and we want to create a script for the English language. And we want to do it kind of in the way that the ancient Hebrews, and again, I'm suggesting that's Manasseh and Ephraim probably in the background working together to develop this. We want to use their method. So we're going to be fiendish and not include vowels. And we're going to connect words together, right? Just as they did, silly as it may sound. So here's how we do it. Well, I draw this, and this, by the way, is the extent of my artistic abilities. This is a boat, if you can't tell. You can see the sail on the mast. And so when you see the boat, according to then this is called the acrophonic system. You see a picture, you pronounce the first consonant of the word. So you see the boat, what do you pronounce? B, exactly. Got it. Okay, we can move on. Now we see this. That's a door. We pronounce D. So B and D. Then we have, oh, look at that, another boat. See, I can draw. And that's another B sound. And then this is a gate, which makes a G sound. Bingo. So there are letters B, D, B, G. What did we just write? And how many words are there? The bad news is there are lots of options, right? So what does this say and how many words? I'm going to tell you what I want it to say, which is my prerogative, right, as the author. So, B, D, we put any vowel we want. It can be an I, E, A, O, U, and whatever else, right? So, let's say we use the short E vowel, eh. That means our word is bed. So every time we see a boat and a door together, we've just written bed. We can read it in the acrophonic system. And I'm deciding that I'm going to cut the word right there. So it stops after that second letter, and the letter B starts the next word. So we have B and G. And I've decided that I'm going to use the short I vowel there, so it's going to be big. So what I have for my second word is big. And if I put it together, and I've done this in a way that models after Hebrew, which is like Spanish and some other languages, where you put the adjective after the noun in most cases, especially attributive position. So the Hebrew would say, the boat big is what I took with me to the lake. But really it means the big boat, so we'd have to switch that into English. So the translation would be a big boat, or if there's only one of a kind in the universe, according to the Hebrew mind, it already has inherent definiteness, so it would be the big bed. Did I say boat? I meant bed. The big bed. So that's our way of creating a script with English using the acrophonic system that Ephraim and Manasseh used. That's how simple it is. And think of the beauty of this. Think of the genius involved. Because with cuneiform, which was the first script ever invented, all you have are these triangles and these triangles with tails and, one other thing. And these are essentially wedge shapes that, depending on how many of them you have and the direction they're pointed and so forth, will determine a number of different things, including syllabics, or a syllable that you would pronounce. So that was very complex, and so in Mesopotamia, virtually only the scribes and the aristocracy were writing this script. It was for the elite. And hieroglyphics in Egypt, of course, 800 plus signs. There's all kinds of different functions for hieroglyphs, and it's a very difficult language to work with. Trust me, I studied it long enough to know that's true. It's probably the hardest language I've ever studied. And it is not a script for the average ancient person. Very difficult. But this one, the derivative of hieroglyphics, at least pictorially, is absolutely intuitive and simplistic and user-friendly. Because now a simple person who can just look at pictures, know the words, can read what is being written. This transformed the world. And it was all done because Jacob decided he wanted his two eldest grandsons under Joseph, his son, to come live among their uncles. And they would have been the ones to create this first alphabetic script as native Egyptian speakers and writers. All right, so that's how it works. In my book, the most important single page I would suggest is in the very front. I asked the publisher to put in the front this chart, which becomes the framework, right? It's like if you're an anatomy or biology professor and you have a skeleton in the closet at the office, right, in the classroom. This is the skeletal structure. Yeah, and you have a handout in your packet with this alphabetic chart. So how does this work? Well, on the far left column, we'll go left to right. The far left column is what's called the Hebrew block letter. There's other words for it, or designations, but that's one of them, Hebrew block letters. The Israelites, the Judites, if you will, whoever among the descendants of Israel who are surviving, during the Babylonian captivity that began in 587, they embraced the Aramaic block letter writing script. They essentially abandoned their own, more or less for all practical purposes, they abandoned their own and they embraced this block letter system of Aramaic. And when they came out of the captivity and came back to the land, they were writing Hebrew with these new block letters, many of which look absolutely nothing like the consonants they would write with before. So, as we study Hebrew today, these are the kinds of letters that we study, these block letters that are from post-587 BC. But this isn't the original. The original goes way back to at least 1842 BC. Second column, This is the proto-consonantal Hebrew original letter I'm suggesting that Manasseh and Ephraim would have decided or determined would be the way that you would write that certain letter. So the Aleph, which means ox or cattle, right here, and this in this case just the head of it, can be drawn with a hieroglyph. So, in fact, the next column is the hieroglyph from which it comes. So the predecessor to the original proto-consonantal Hebrew letter is an Egyptian hieroglyph. So that's the third column. So this is the hieroglyph right here, F1, and then that's what it looks like to its left when they would have written it. It's a little bit more country, a little bit more backwoods, if you will. So the Egyptian scribes always, especially on monumental architecture that was in stone, they would inscribe with amazing precision, virtually indistinguishable, right? Unless you were a, autograph reader, very hard to distinguish. So those are the first three columns. The fourth column, I have the Hebrew word that acts as the source or the connection behind that pictograph. So whatever word that is, and in this case, the first letter in the alphabet is Aleph, which again means ox or cattle. So when you draw the ox or cattle, you pronounce this. It's actually a consonant we don't use. It's guttural. It comes from the throat. So usually when Hebrew is taught in the United States, we just consider this a silent letter. It wasn't really silent in the ancient world, but we don't really reproduce it in our language, so we just kind of skip it in our study of Hebrew. So that brings us then to the next column, 1, 2, 3, 4, fifth column from the left. This is how the Hebrew proto-consonantal letters were used in that early period just after it was formed. So we have examples, for example, of the Aleph from Sinai 377 here, and then from Wadi al-Hol 1 here and Wadi al-Hol 2 here. And you can see that they're extremely pictorial. The features of the ox's head are all drawn carefully and diligently, as if an artist, maybe not professional, but someone who loves art is drawing it. Way better than I can do. I just trace these. And then if you look at the next column, so that was from roughly 1842 BC to 1760. So all of these letters are attested in inscriptions. For this column, this Hebrew consonantals of the Middle Kingdom, all of these are attested in inscriptions between 1842 and 1760 BC. Then we move to a new time period. The New Kingdom, 1560 to 1307 formally. And so all of these inscriptions fit within that time frame, or these representations of the letters. And you can see, if you contrast them with the ones that went earlier, you can see, for example, that these ox's heads were drawn less pictorial. So there's no more eye, E-Y-E, that's drawn. There's virtually no more mouth that's drawn. The horns are drawn a little bit faster and easier, and the head becomes more simple, until the point where in that same period of time, on the far right in this column, you have what looks like an A letter. And that's attested in Sinai 375c. And that is an Aleph. Well, if you take the one that's to its left, that's Sinai 359, and you take this ox's head here, and you make this look like a V, and then have this cross here, and then you flip that 180 degrees, it's going to become almost exactly like what you see to its right. So it's a very simple movement, and that's what would happen with these letters. There was a progression to go from from more pictorial to more abstract over time. And that makes perfect sense, doesn't it? Because you don't want to spend all of your time like an artist drawing every letter one at a time. Carefully drawing an ox's head every single time. Make sure the antlers are right. Make sure they're even. Make sure your eye is in the right place and your mouth is right where it should be. No. Write it faster and easier. So, time was not kind to the pictorial value of each letter, or most letters. So over time, and I invented a term in my book called residual pictographic value. How much residual pictographic value was there for any certain letter over time as it went along, did it become so abstract that you could no longer see the picture behind it. But think about it. If it's a slow process over decades and centuries, it's not a problem, because it's a gradual evolution of the form of the letter, becoming more abstract. We write an A today, right? We do this and this to write our capital A. What does that mean to us? What in life does those symbols, those strokes, what does it connect to? The answer is nothing. There's no connection. Your mind has absorbed from long ago that you can connect that formation of those three strokes, and it's always going to be the A letter. You can do that. Your mind can do that. And their mind could do that. So they moved in this direction of abstraction. And then, of course, when Hebrew got to a point later, and here the last column is this is the Iron Age, from 1150 BC to 587 BC, you can see how the letters have evolved now. And there's virtually no pictographic value, for example, in the far right with the Aleph or Aleph letter. You don't see anything that resembles an ox's head there, do you? No, because it's changed over time. So I tried to put letters in here that would show you as well as I could the progression of this losing of pictorial value over time. And to show you the continuity from 1842 BC to 587 BC. It's a slow, gradual, but predictable movement going from pictorial to abstract. All right, so that's how it all works. And then my next slide actually is looking at the second half of the alphabet. So you can look at this for yourself. I did give you a handout. If you want the electronic version of this, I've uploaded a JPEG file of this to my academia.edu webpage, and you can download it and have it and use it and, teach it to others. Do whatever you want with it, as long as you're kind and nice. And so that's the alphabet. And this chart then acts as a grid by which you can, if you know a little bit of Hebrew, right? You know the Hebrew alphabet, and you have a Hebrew lexicon, and you have this chart, you also can translate ancient Hebrew inscriptions that potentially nobody has translated before. You have that ability. You can do it. A 10-year-old can do this. I can teach this to a 10-year-old easily. Easily. And maybe they could even excel beyond what I could do. I don't know. All right, so now let's look at a few inscriptions. The first one, and our focus will be on the Middle Kingdom first, and there's only one inscription from the Middle Kingdom we will look at. We could look at all of these, but we only have time. We're only making time for one, and that's Sinai 376. It's on the bottom. It dates to approximately 1772. We can be confident of its dating because it's connected to another inscription that's datable with an Egyptian renal year date on it. So 1772 is the time to which it dates. It's from the site of Wadi Nasib, which is the water hole or the water source for the miners who went down to Sinai from Egypt to extract turquoise. They obviously had to have water to survive, and if water could be found, and Wadi Nasib was the place to find it. So what does Sinai 376 say? Well, here is a photo. It's actually a very nice photo. The resolution is very nice. From a book from, I think it's 1962, a German scholar published this inscription, Gerster, and it's on page 65 of his book. It's cited in my bibliography, in my book, and you can probably see that there are vertical columns, right? Vertical columns of letters like this. What does it mean? Now, what I was able to do, of course, is put this photo onto Microsoft PowerPoint and vary the magnification all the way up to 400%, so I could look really detailed at one letter or a stroke or a possible stroke. And of course, because this is inscribed on stone, you have the really big problem of what we call false friends, which means lines in the stone that were put there naturally or by some other means that have nothing to do with something that was inscribed as a letter. And of course, it's a challenge sometimes to distinguish between real friends and false friends, just like in life, right? So, what I did is I used PowerPoint to carefully draw and then edit points to make exact where the strokes were. And I wrote all of these in, and you're going to see it in a flash, but believe me, it took a lot of time. And there it is. There's where all the letters are. And so I put those in black, and I grayed the areas where there was a huge divot in the stone or something else that it was an imperfection that never could have been used to write something, because that's part of the inscription that just can't be used because of the contour. So then I take away the picture, and I'm left with the inscription. And now I have to decipher this alphabetic inscription. Now, the early Israelites who were writing in Proto-Consonantal Hebrew, they followed Egyptian convention in how to write. In other words, the direction of your letters from one to the next. There were 3 options, and 3 options only. There was top to bottom. There was, for you, left to right and right to left. But never, ever, ever, ever bottom to top. So this one's easy, right? Piece of cake. Anybody can translate it. It's top to bottom. And it just so happens that this one moves from right to left. So this column is the first column, this column is the second column, this column is the third column, this column is the fourth, and this letter, which other scholars have not identified as being on this inscription. Guess what? I have news for you, folks. When you start translating these inscriptions and something all of a sudden doesn't make sense, you have to study the inscription like no scholar who came before you. So, no other scholar writes the yad or hand letter right here. I do. I'm sorry. The hand. It's the yad hand that becomes yod in our alphabet. So when you put all this together, and of course I had to go through it letter by letter. And if you would ask, how do you know that it goes vertically top to bottom, but moves from right to left in the columns rather than left to right? Well, it's called trial and error. One way will work consistently, one way will eventually fail for you. So it became clear that it was right to left. So I started with this, and here we have the house. It's from bait, the Hebrew word bait. It comes from it, house of. And so that square is a house, so it makes the b sound. That's a taish, which is a male goat. And there's a fascinating story behind the male goat letter. I'm sorry, behind the tau letter, the last letter in the alphabet, in the Hebrew alphabet, that makes the t sound, tau. In that they used a hieroglyph that looks like a plus sign. And that plus sign, it doesn't make sense with any Hebrew word that you can study. No word in the Hebrew Bible, I will vouch, I will argue with you vehemently if you disagree. No Hebrew word in the Hebrew alphabet, beginning with a tau, the final letter, looks like a plus sign. None. And I said, every other letter looks like, makes sense. There's a concept behind the pictograph to connect it. How can this be connected when nothing looks like a plus sign? Then I decided I need to go deeper. I need to go into Middle Egyptian. So I found all the Middle Egyptian words that begin with the hieroglyph that looks like a plus sign. And sure enough, I came into contact with the word for a male goat, which begins with a plus sign and ends with a determinative hieroglyph of a goat. And it's taish. There's an Egyptian word for this, and and so the Egyptian word begins with that plus sign and ends with a male goat. And their word, which is pronounced differently, starts with that plus sign, ends with the goat. So if you have a Hebrew speaker who knows Middle Egyptian, can read Middle Egyptian, and he's used to reading the word for a goat, and sometimes, by the way, folks, I have news for you, they would abbreviate in Egyptian. They would either cut off the male goat as the determinative hieroglyph at the end, or they would just write the plus sign, and that's enough to communicate the goat. They could do that. They could abbreviate that like that, just like we do when we abbreviate. So the Hebrew creator of the alphabet had to know Hebrew, had to know Middle Egyptian. And in knowing Middle Egyptian, he had to know that the goat word starts with the plus sign looking hieroglyph, ends in a goat, and the Hebrew word for male goat is tayish. So when you see the plus sign in your mind, you connect it to a male goat because you're used to saying that in Middle Egyptian. So you write the plus, that's a goat. It makes perfect sense to Ephraim and Manasseh and me. If you disagree, you are on your own. So, T is the male goat, right? Tayish, male goat. Bayit, Tayish, bait. There it is, bait. Bait is Hebrew for house of. And then we have Kerem. And so the inscription goes like this. I won't go through them one letter or word at a time. The house of the vineyard of Asnath and its innermost room were engraved. They have come to life. So the word Asnath begins right here with this very ugly looking. That's kind of like I would draw it. Ox's head, and then this fish that makes the S sound, and then this snake that makes the N sound. So Asnat, right there. That's Asnat. So the house of the vineyard of Asnath and its innermost room were engraved. They have come to life. What does this inscription mean? Took a long time to think through this one. I think I figured it out. Who is Asnath? Joseph's wife's name is Asnath. She's the only character in the Bible named Asnath. And her name is inscribed here.